if you're a knowledge worker,
Mm.
I feel like I'm a knowledge worker. I feel like you're a knowledge worker. If you're a knowledge worker like Kat and Tim, ooh, it feels easier to design a life free from the tyranny of 9 to 5. It's kind of
Ooh.
wordy.
And it's a little spicy, actually.
I could say flexibility, but what does flexibility mean?
I don't know. I think it means different things to different people, to be honest. But hmm.
I remember this is such a mundane example, but I remember in the past when I was in the office, previous jobs, if there was something wrong with my car and I needed it serviced, it was a hassle because I had to find somewhere I could drop the car off early enough so I
Mm,
could still get to work.
right.
But then picking it up was a challenge as well. I mean, such
Yeah.
a simple thing. Cars need maintenance.
Mm,
They need to be regularly serviced if you want it to keep running. Um, but now with remote work, it's not that big a deal to go out to the mechanic, leave it, come back to work, go back. There's just a lot more flexibility.
there's more fluidity, I guess. That's what I find too. I think it just fluidity. It's just like if you need to do something. And it's although I guess for me as well, and working and reflecting back even on freelance, even if I was working at an agency at the time, I just found like it wasn't 9 to 5, but it wasn't 9 to 5 like burnout night. Like you're not doing like 9 till 7 at the office. It didn't feel like that. Because you could go and I don't know, take your lunch like a little bit later because you had an appointment or you had to do this or that. But then it wasn't like, you would just make sure you got everything that you needed done in that day. It didn't like impede getting things done, if that makes sense. Whereas when you're tied to a location, it kind of feels like when you do have to take those breaks, if it's like a big disruption to getting those things done because that specific, maybe it's just again the way that the brain works. It feels like because you're not there, it's a different space of work, if that makes sense. Like I wouldn't want to bring my work back home with me. I'm sure plenty of people did then and they still do now, but because there's no, I just get the work done. Like that's just the way it is.
Yeah. So the sense of fluidity
Mm,
to me, fluidity is such a nice word. It sounds so much more appealing than what I said. Freedom from the tyranny, from the shackles of 9 to 5. But fluidity, it seems that this new work environment or way to work is really optimized for adults and
mm-hmm.
people who know how to take responsibility for their lives and their work. Whereas, tied to a location, to me, feels a bit like, having to sit in the classroom
That's true,
in
but I
in
mean,
high school or primary
yeah,
school.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point. Um, really good point. And then it also, if we're talking about, I know because we both have, kids in high school with yours closer to university than mine, then it also means, when once they make that jump to university when there isn't necessarily that confine of the classroom, or there is, but it's not the same model or format. That can be really, I guess, the trialing for that student, to not have, they have to just rely on their own motivation, discipline, their own sort of sense of what study is, which can be confronting, even if you think you've prepared for it in year 11 and 12, which I know they do now. Yeah, it's just kind of like, here you go, you're on your own. Like, you're responsible for this now. So it's an
Mm.
interesting and then I get obviously then to take that into a workplace once you begin your professional career is another step again. So it's quite an interesting thought. for sure
Yeah.
there.
Fluidity. I love it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the caveat is when you can't turn off at all. But I think again that just comes down to your own discipline to say, okay, well, it's now 7:30, 8 o'clock, like it's time to stop. But it
Yeah.
goes down to those laws of like being able to say yes or no to your employer, which I know I don't we have it. I don't know if it's been formalized in Australia or whether it was just
The
talked
right
about.
to
But
disconnect.
yeah, yeah, I think that's still obviously very important.
Yeah, imagine like a variation on that scene in The Matrix where Neo has to make a choice between the red and the blue pill, but instead of the pills, it's like in one hand you have back-to-back meetings and no responsibility to think for yourself, or in the other you have complete fluidity but total responsibility for your outcomes. Anyway, something to think about. I know which one I would choose.
That sounds actually like the dichotomy between being working for somebody else and working for yourself, actually, doesn't it? In some
Yeah,
ways.
well, that is a really interesting area of inquiry, maybe a future episode, because even working for someone else, if you're working in a hybrid environment, a remote environment, what is going to help you thrive in that environment, even though you are working for an employer, is that sense of entrepreneurialism. So if you have some of those skills or tendencies, perhaps you're going to thrive better in a remote environment, even if you are working for an employer.
Hmm. Yeah,
Right.
definitely.